It is the winter of 1803, in a quiet house in Washington, and a man is sitting alone with a candle and a map that is mostly guesswork. He is the President of the United States, and tonight he is about to do something almost nobody in his government fully understands. He is going to send 2 men and a small company of soldiers into a country that does not belong to his nation, to search for something he cannot prove exists. He will tell the public it is a mission of discovery. That much will be true, but only on the surface. Underneath the surface is a different mission entirely, and the 2 men he trusts with it, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, will not fully grasp, even as they set out, that the very thing they've been sent to find might not be real at all. For the next 2.5 years, they will chase that thing across an entire continent. They will haul a boat against a river that seems to fight back with every mile. They will go hungry. They will freeze in mountains that were never supposed to be there. They will walk, unarmed in any real sense, into the territory of nations far more powerful than the small republic they represent, and they will live only because those nations allow them to. They will lose horses to starvation, not to accident. They will be given up for dead by the country that sent them. And at the far end of all of it, on the shoulder of a mountain, waits the thing this whole gamble was built around: a river. One very specific river, imagined to run gently all the way from the middle of the continent to the edge of the Pacific Ocean. A water highway stretching clean across North America, so that a man might load cargo onto a boat in the heartland and float, with only one short break, to the other side of the world. Find that river, and the young United States would not simply have a new map. It would have the master key to an entire continent, and a claim that no European empire could easily challenge. There was only one difficulty with this beautiful idea. It did not exist, but that is not the version most of us were handed in school. We were given something tidier: 2 courageous explorers, a grand, patriotic walk into an empty wilderness, men pressing flowers, nomming rivers, and shaking hands with strangers along the way. That version isn't a lie exactly, it's a polish. It's the version with the hunger and the fear and the secret orders and the quiet, cold calculation sanded down until all that's left is a mural. 2 men in buckskin, pointing heroically toward a setting sun. The true story is far stranger than the mural. What if the most celebrated expedition in American history failed completely at the one job it was actually sent to do, and the nation simply decided to call the failure a triumph instead? What if the empty land they crossed was not empty in the slightest, but thick with governments, borders, languages, economies, and old rivalries, and the explorers were never conquerors marching through a void, but guests tolerated, appraised, and occasionally very nearly killed? What if the men back in Washington already suspected in some quiet corner of their minds that the dream was false and sent their friends west regardless? Because some dreams are too expensive to give up on. If you are here tonight to drift off to sleep, that is exactly the purpose these long, slow histories serve. So get comfortable. Let your shoulders drop. And if it feels right, leave a comment before you go under. Tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight, and what hour it is where you are. There's something quietly moving about knowing that somewhere a person in Manila is watching the morning arrive, while somebody in Toronto is still awake at 3 in the morning, and somebody else in Berlin has the hum of a sleeping city drifting through a cracked window. All of us, in our separate corners of the earth, floating through the same old story in the dark. Tonight we travel back a little more than 200 years. Not to the version in the history books, with its clean lines and comfortable conclusions, but to a dim room in Washington, where a brilliant, restless man is staring at a map of a place he has never once set foot in, and deciding to wager 2 lives on a river that exists only inside his own imagination. We will follow that river north and west, up the Missouri, into the territory of nations who hold every real advantage, through a winter that ought to have finished the whole expedition. Alongside a teenage girl carrying an infant across 1,000 miles of hostile country, whose quiet presence will save the mission more than once. Toward a coincidence so improbable that if it appeared in a novel, you would set the book down in disbelief. And finally, to a single afternoon on a mountain pass, where one exhausted man climbs the last rise certain that he is about to win everything, and instead comes face to face with a ghost. So let's begin at the true beginning, not with the river. With the dream that came long before it. Chapter 1. An old hope. To understand why two men were sent to risk their lives for a river, you first have to understand how ancient the dream behind that river really was. It did not start with Thomas Jefferson. It started nearly 3 centuries earlier, in the moment the first European ships collided with a landmass nobody in Europe had been expecting, and their captains realized, with something close to despair, that this enormous, uncharted wall of earth stood directly between them and everything they actually wanted, because they had never set out looking for America. They had been looking for Asia, for silk, for spice, for the almost mythical wealth of the East. And now here was an entire unplanned continent, stretching from one frozen ocean to the other, blocking the route with no obvious way around it. So Europe began to hope. Somewhere, surely, there had to be a gap, a strait, a river running clean through from one side to the other that would let a ship glide from the Atlantic straight into the Pacific without ever once unloading its cargo. They named this imagined gap before they had ever laid eyes on it, the Northwest Passage. And for roughly 300 years, sailors pushed north into the ice chasing it. Ships were crushed. Crews disappeared without a trace. Entire expeditions sailed out and were simply never heard from again, swallowed by a passage that, in the shape everyone imagined, had never existed in the first place. Still, the hope refused to die. It was worth too much to let go of. And by the time Thomas Jefferson became the 3rd president of the United States, the dream had simply relocated. If there was no gentle passage around the frozen top of the continent, then perhaps, there was one running directly through the middle of it, along a river. Picture the logic the way Jefferson turned it over by candlelight, late into the night. The Missouri River. A great muddy artery rose somewhere far to the west and rolled down into the center of the continent. And sailors along the Pacific coast had reported another great river, the Columbia, emptying into the ocean on the far western shore. Surely, Jefferson reasoned, these two rivers must reach toward one another somewhere in the high country. Surely their headwaters sat close together, separated by nothing more than a modest ridge, a gentle hill, a short carry where a man might lift a canoe from one river system into the other in a single afternoon. That was the entire dream, distilled down to its simplest form. Haul your boat over one low rise. Set it back into the water on the far side. Float the rest of the way to the ocean. If a portage like that truly existed, then whichever nation controlled it would effectively control trade between two oceans, and by extension, a meaningful share of trade with the entire world. And here is where the dream stops being merely romantic and becomes something closer to a weapon. Jefferson was not simply a man chasing beauty or curiosity. He was a man chasing survival for his country. Britain was pressing down out of Canada, its fur trading companies pushing steadily westward, mapping as they advanced. Spain held vast territories to the southwest and claimed still more. Russia was creeping down the Pacific coastline from the north. The interior of the continent was quietly being divided up among empires far older, richer, and more powerful than the fledgling United States. Whoever discovered the water route first would hold a claim that would be very difficult for anyone else to dislodge. So the river inside Jefferson's head was never really about geography at all. It was about the future of a nation. It was the difference between a small, fragile republic clinging to the Atlantic coastline and a power that might one day reach, unbroken from ocean to ocean. And Jefferson wanted this so badly, believed in it so completely, that he was prepared to do something that on paper should have been almost impossible for a country as young and undercapitalized as his. He was prepared to buy an entire continent he had never seen, in pursuit of a road he could not even prove was there, which is precisely what he did next. And the story of how he did it is so reckless, so enormous, and so strange that it barely seems like something that could have actually happened. Chapter 2. A continent, bought on faith. In the spring and summer of 1803, Thomas Jefferson closed the largest single land transaction in recorded history, and he stumbled into most of it almost by accident. He had only wanted a city. New Orleans sat at the mouth of the Mississippi River, and whoever controlled that port effectively controlled the flow of trade for the entire American interior. Any foreign power holding New Orleans could strangle the young United States economy whenever it pleased. So Jefferson sent envoys to France to try to negotiate the purchase of the city itself, or at minimum, the right to use its harbor freely. But France, at that particular moment, was governed by Napoleon Bonaparte, and Napoleon had far bigger problems on his plate. War with Britain was looming. A catastrophic rebellion was unfolding in the French colony of Saint-Domingue in the Caribbean. His treasury was thin. He had no appetite for defending a vast, distant wilderness in North America that he likely could not hold on to anyway. So instead of selling a city, he offered something nobody in the American delegation had anticipated. Not New Orleans alone, the entire Louisiana Territory. Not the modest present-day state that shares the name, but a colossal expanse of land stretching from the Mississippi River deep into the west, climbing all the way toward the Rocky Mountains. Hundreds of millions of acres, a territory so large that it would roughly double the size of the United States with a single signature on a single piece of paper. Consider the position those American negotiators suddenly found themselves in. They had crossed an ocean to buy one port city. They were now being offered, out of nowhere, a third of a continent for a price, and only if they agreed on the spot before Napoleon had time to reconsider. There was no opportunity to write home for instructions. The decision had to be made immediately in the room with no guidance from Washington. They said yes. For roughly $15 million, the United States acquired a wilderness it could not measure, could not accurately picture, and had, for the most part, never physically walked. And here is the detail that ought to keep you turning it over in your mind. Jefferson, the man who had just doubled the size of his country, had only the vaguest sense of what that land actually contained. Nobody in Washington truly knew. They did not know how wide the territory stretched. They did not know how tall the mountains climbed, or how many separate ranges lay hidden inside them, or whether the river systems connected the way the old dream demanded they should. The maps available to the American government were patchworks of rumor, guesswork, and blank space, occasionally decorated with mountain ranges that did not exist and rivers sketched from pure imagination. A few older maps still marked unexplored regions with mythical creatures, simply because nobody had any better information to put there. It had been, in every meaningful sense, a purchase made on faith. And now that the young nation had spent a genuine fortune on this vast, unmeasured unknown, one question pressed harder than any other. The same question that had haunted European explorers for 3 centuries, except now it was urgent, personal, and extraordinarily expensive to get wrong. Was the river actually there? Was there truly a water passage running through the middle of this newly purchased American empire? Or had the country just gambled its entire future on a stretch of land that could never be crossed? There was only one way to find out. Someone had to walk into the unknown and either locate the passage, or prove once, and for all that the oldest hope of the New World had always been an illusion. And Jefferson already knew, with total certainty, exactly which young man he intended to send. Chapter 3. The camouflage of science here is where the polished version of this story and the true one begin to quietly pull apart. In the account most people are taught, the expedition Jefferson organized is framed as a scientific undertaking, a journey driven by pure intellectual curiosity, sending brave men out to catalog plants, animals, and rivers simply to expand human knowledge. And there is real truth buried in that framing. The expedition genuinely did collect specimens. It genuinely did document hundreds of species entirely unknown to scientists back east. Jefferson himself adored that part of the mission. He was a man capable of losing an entire evening to the shape of a fossil or the variety of a corn seed. But that was never the actual reason the expedition existed. And Jefferson knew it perfectly well. When he approached Congress to request funding, he did not stand up and openly announce a bold, expansionist mission to secure a water route to the Pacific ahead of the British. He couldn't. A great deal of the territory he intended to send his men through wasn't even legally American at the time of planning. It was still contested or claimed outright by other foreign powers. To publicly declare that the United States was dispatching an armed party to survey and lay claim to land it did not own would have amounted to a serious diplomatic provocation, possibly even grounds for war. So Jefferson sent his request in confidence, a private message intended for Congress alone, asking for what he described as a modest sum of money, and he dressed the entire proposal in gentle, academic language. He spoke of expanding commerce, of building friendly relationships with native nations, of the general advancement of human knowledge. He framed the whole enterprise as something closer to a literary or scientific pursuit than a political one. It was camouflage. Underneath that soft language, the actual instructions Jefferson eventually handed to the man he selected were considerably more pointed. Locate the most direct water route across the continent for the purposes of commerce. Chart it precisely. Establish, through your physical presence, an American claim on the land. Study the native nations you encounter not purely out of goodwill, but to assess their populations, their military strength, their trading networks, and their political alliances. Exactly the kind of intelligence a rising power gathers about territory it intends to absorb eventually. Watch closely for British traders. Watch for Spanish outposts. Note precisely how far their influence extends. This was never a nature walk. It was reconnaissance dressed as science, an intelligence-gathering mission and a land claim, wearing the costume of scholarly curiosity. And that costume proved so convincing that it has survived, largely unquestioned, for over 2 centuries. It is still the costume worn by the story in most classrooms and murals today, the noble discoverers, gathering knowledge in an untouched wilderness. Hold onto that idea. It's going to matter again before this night is over. The expedition was never truly about what it happened to find along the way. It was about what it had been sent to accomplish. And what it had been sent to accomplish was a dream of continental power, smuggled west under a polite fiction, into a country that did not, in any legal or moral sense, belong to the men making the claim. Chapter 4. The 2 men and the 40 Jefferson now needed someone to carry that dream into the wilderness. Someone he trusted absolutely, since once this man departed, he would be beyond the reach of any letter, any order, any rescue for years at a stretch. He chose a young man he already knew intimately, Meriwether Lewis. In some ways, Lewis was an unusual choice. He was still fairly young, in his late 20s, though he had already served in the army and knew frontier life well. For the past several years, he had been living inside the president's own household, serving as Jefferson's private secretary. The 2 men understood each other's minds closely. Jefferson had spent months quietly preparing Lewis for exactly this mission, arranging for him to learn celestial navigation, so he could calculate precise positions using the stars, training him in botanical preservation, teaching him basic medicine for treating illness and injury on the trail, and coaching him in the surveying techniques that would eventually turn an unknown wilderness into an accurate map. Lewis was intelligent, deeply observant, and completely devoted to the mission ahead of him. He was also, according to nearly everyone who knew him well, a man carrying real shadows, moody, prone to long stretches of darkness, capable of brilliance under pressure, and then a heaviness afterward that nobody around him seemed able to lift. Keep that detail in mind too. It stays quiet for now, but it does not remain quiet forever. Lewis understood almost immediately that no single man could carry a mission of this size alone. So he wrote to an old friend from his army days and asked him to share command. A man he trusted without reservation, William Clark. If Lewis was the dreamer, the scholar, the man wrestling with private storms, Clark was the steady counterweight. Older, calmer, intensely practical, a natural leader of men, and a gifted cartographer capable of translating a river bend or a distant ridgeline into startlingly accurate lines on paper. Where Lewis brooded, Clark organized. Where Lewis saw poetry in the landscape, Clark saw angles, distances, and bearings. Together they formed something genuinely rare in the history of exploration. Two commanders who, across years of hardship and danger, essentially never turned against one another. In an expedition where nearly everything else eventually broke down under strain, their partnership held firm. Around these two men gathered the rest of what would become known as the Corps of Discovery, roughly 40 individuals in the Corps traveling party. Soldiers, hunters, boatmen, mostly young men chosen for physical strength and practical skill, most of them with only a hazy idea of what they were actually walking into. Two members of that party are too frequently left out of the mural entirely. One was a man named York. He was enslaved, the legal property of William Clark, brought west not as a free member of the expedition but as another man's possession. And yet York performed every task the others performed. He paddled, he hunted, he carried impossible loads, he scouted dangerous ground. To many of the native peoples the expedition encountered, who had never before seen a black man, York became an object of genuine fascination and curiosity. And in the wilderness, he briefly lived something closer to equal standing than he had ever experienced in his life. When the journey ended and the other men were rewarded with land grants, back pay, and public honor, York was simply returned to slavery. Remember his name. History gave him far less credit than he earned. The other was not a person at all, but a large Newfoundland dog named Seaman, who walked the entire distance to the Pacific Ocean and back again, and somehow survived every mile of it. This, then, was the core of the expedition. A small handful of men, a few boats, a dog, and a closely guarded secret, about to disappear into a continent that had no idea they were coming, and would not have been especially impressed if it had. Chapter 5. Leaving the Known World. Try to picture the actual morning they set off. The Missouri River, thick and brown and endless, sliding past the wooden hulls of the boats. Men loading the last barrels of salt pork, kegs of gunpowder, crates of trade goods, boxes of instruments. The entire survival of 40 human beings packed into a keelboat and two smaller pirogues that would need to carry them for thousands upon thousands of miles. Behind them, the last edge of anything resembling familiar country. Ahead, a river climbing northwest into a landscape that existed on their maps mostly as a hopeful sketch. They pushed off in May of 1804, and almost immediately, the mural version of this story falls apart. Ascending the Missouri was never an adventure in any romantic sense. It was closer to a slow-motion war, fought every single day, for month after grinding month. The Missouri does not behave like a gentle waterway. It drags along enormous quantities of mud and entire drowned trees just beneath its surface, hidden traps waiting to tear the bottom out of an unlucky boat. Its banks collapse without warning, sometimes dropping tons of loose earth straight into the current. And because the expedition was traveling upstream, climbing directly against the river's flow toward its source, the current fought them constantly, at every single mile. So when the wind was favorable, they hoisted a sail. When it wasn't, they rowed. When rowing failed against the current, they took up long wooden poles and pushed the boats forward inch by inch off the riverbed. And when even that failed, men waded into the water and mud, tied ropes to the hull, and simply dragged the boats upstream by brute physical force. Hour after hour, their bare feet slashed open by hidden rocks and prickly pear cactus, the sun beating down without mercy, clouds of biting insects rising off the water thick enough to breathe in. Imagine trying to sleep after a day like that. Soaked through, sunburned, insect-bitten, your hands raw and blistered, lying on hard ground beside a river that will demand precisely the same punishment from you again tomorrow, and the day after that, for as long as it takes to reach a place no one from your world has ever laid eyes on. This is the texture the mural leaves out entirely. For enormous stretches, the expedition was simply suffering, slow, repetitive, grinding suffering, measured not in miles but in exhausted yards. And yet, as they climbed higher along the river, the surrounding country began to transform. The dense eastern forests gave way, slowly and then all at once, to open, rolling grassland stretching farther than the eye could hold, an ocean of grass beneath an enormous open sky. And that land, it turned out, was teeming with life in a way that genuinely stunned the men. Herds of bison in numbers so vast they seemed to darken the horizon. Elk, deer, pronghorn antelope, wolves trailing the herds. And one creature they had been warned about but did not yet fully respect. An enormous, powerfully built bear, faster and far harder to kill than anything they had ever hunted, that would soon teach them genuine fear. To their eyes, all of this looked like untouched wilderness, empty, waiting, unclaimed. And that impression, that this land was empty and open for the taking, was the single most dangerous mistake the expedition could have made, because it was not empty. It had never been empty, and they were about to learn exactly how wrong they were. Chapter 6: A Crowded Ancient World. Here is the reversal sitting at the very center of this whole story, the one that quietly rewrites everything you thought you understood about it. The American West of 1804 was not a blank space on a map. It was a fully realized world, a crowded, ancient, deeply organized civilization made up of nations who had lived on that exact land for hundreds of generations, who understood every river bend and seasonal migration, and mountain pass the way you understand the rooms of your own house. These were not scattered, simple bands drifting through an empty wilderness. These were peoples with names, with governments, with borders, with legal customs, with long and complicated histories, with old rivalries and careful alliances, and with economies that stretched across staggering distances. Along that river system stood great trading towns, places where goods moved across half the continent, where corn and beans grown by farming nations were exchanged for meat and hides brought in by hunting peoples from the plains, and where shells from a distant ocean and metals from far-off regions passed from hand to hand along trade routes that had existed long before any European country was founded. There were formal diplomatic systems, with established rules governing both war and peace, and the treatment of guests. There were nations on those plains capable of fielding more mounted, armed warriors than the entire United States government could realistically have sent against them. The core of Discovery, by comparison, was tiny. Roughly 40 exhausted men, deep inside territory that legally belonged to none of them, hundreds of miles from any possible reinforcement. If the nations they encountered had chosen, at nearly any point along the journey, to wipe the expedition out entirely, they could have done so with relative ease. So the expedition was never simply marching through open country. It was negotiating its way through, one nation at a time. And this is the part that the heroic version of the story buries most deeply of all. At every significant nation they reached, Lewis and Clark performed a carefully rehearsed ritual. They assembled the local leaders. They distributed gifts, bright fabric, metal tools, glass beads, tobacco, and specially minted medals stamped with the face of a man virtually none of these people had ever heard of. And they delivered a speech, always some version of the same speech. They announced the existence of a new great father ruling from far away in the east. They declared that a vast and powerful nation now claimed this land and everyone living on it. They informed the gathered leaders that they were now, whether they had asked to be or not, considered subjects of this distant ruler, and that they should keep the peace, trade honestly with Americans, and offer their obedience. Picture how that must have actually landed. Imagine standing among your own people, on land that had belonged to your family for longer than anyone could remember, when a small band of exhausted, unfamiliar-smelling foreigners arrives by boat, unable even to feed themselves without local help, unable to read the surrounding country at all, and these same strangers calmly announce that you now belong to a king you have never met, living in a place you cannot picture, and that the very ground beneath your feet, the ground holding the bones of your ancestors, now has a new legal owner. To the Americans, this was formal diplomacy, words that carried real weight, a flag effectively planted through language. To the nations receiving that message, it must often have landed somewhere between meaningless and outright bizarre. These were peoples with their own established power structures, their own alliances, their own clear sense of identity. They felt no particular need for a distant father figure across an ocean they had never seen. Some nations were curious about these newcomers, hoping the visitors might bring useful trade goods or valuable weapons. Some were cautiously welcoming, and at least one nation along the river was entirely unimpressed, a nation that understood exactly how much leverage its position gave it and was fully prepared to use that leverage. The expedition's first serious test was coming, and it very nearly ended the entire mission before it had properly begun. Chapter 7: The Standoff on the Riverbank. The Americans called this nation the Teton Sioux, a branch of the Lakota people, and they controlled a critical stretch of the Missouri River the way a toll collector controls a bridge. This was not accidental geography. It was earned and carefully maintained power. Nations living further upstream needed goods coming from the south. Traders moving up from the south needed safe passage north. The Lakota sat directly in the middle of that entire flow of trade, strong enough, numerous enough, and confident enough to demand tribute from anyone wishing to pass through their stretch of river. When the Corps arrived in this territory in late September of 1804, the meeting soured almost immediately. The Americans had expected the same script that had worked reasonably well with other nations' upstream gifts, a speech about the distant Great Father, medals, and safe passage granted in return. But the gifts offered were seen as insultingly small. The speech about a faraway ruler meant essentially nothing to a nation that answered to no outside authority on its own river. And the Lakota made their position unmistakably clear. If these strangers wished to continue upstream through Lakota-controlled territory, there would be a price: goods, tribute, payment for the privilege of passage. Tensions rose quickly. Picture the scene along that riverbank. The Americans, badly outnumbered, gripping their weapons and trying desperately to project far more strength than their small numbers actually possessed. Lakota warriors gathered close around them, entirely unimpressed, holding every genuine advantage in the confrontation. At one point, one of the expedition's boats was physically seized. At one point, bows were drawn and arrows fitted to strings. At one point, Clark himself drew his sword, and the men aboard the boats readied the small swivel cannon mounted at the bow. And for a handful of breathless seconds, the entire expedition balanced on the edge of a fight it could not conceivably have won. If a single weapon had discharged in that moment, one arrow released, one nervous trigger pulled, the story you are hearing tonight would have ended right there, on a muddy riverbank far up the Missouri, with the bodies of 40 Americans left behind and the collapse of Jefferson's entire continental dream. No Pacific coast, no return journey, no legend. Just a small, forgotten massacre in the tall grass that the wider world would barely have noticed at all. It did not happen. Through a tense mixture of bluff, restraint, and plain good fortune, the moment eventually passed. Weapons were lowered. The expedition was, eventually, permitted to continue upstream. But the lesson should have been carved permanently into the memory of every man present, and into every version of this story told since. They had survived not because they were strong, not because they were clever, not because their flag or their speech about a distant great father carried any real weight out here. They had survived because, in the end, the Lakota chose to allow it. Permission. Hold on to that word, because it is about to save the entire expedition again, this time far more gently, in the middle of a brutal winter that should, by every reasonable measure, have killed them all. Chapter 8: Fort Mandan. By the time real cold settled over the northern plains, the men of the Corps were thoroughly exhausted, and the river had carried them deep into country far removed from anything resembling home. They could go no farther that season. Winter on the open northern plains is not a mere inconvenience. It is a genuine killer. Months of relentless wind and heavy snow and cold severe enough to claim fingers, toes, and lives outright. They needed shelter, they needed food, they needed urgently to stop moving. And here they were fortunate in a way they had done almost nothing to earn, because they had arrived in the territory of the Mandan and Hidatsa nations. These were not small, struggling bands eking out a marginal existence. They were established farming peoples, living in large, permanent towns built of warm, earth-covered lodges, with substantial stored harvests of corn, beans, and squash, and extensive trading networks that pulled goods in from across the continent. Together, their towns held several thousand people, at that particular moment, forming one of the great population and trading centers of the entire northern plains, larger than many an American town back east. The Corps built a modest fortified camp nearby and settled in to wait out the winter of 1804 to 1805. They called it Fort Mandan. Over that long, frozen season, a quiet but undeniable truth became impossible to avoid. The expedition survived that winter because the Mandan and Hidatsa allowed it to. The Americans traded for food again and again, because the local nations had stores of food and the Americans, by that point, largely did not. The men warmed themselves at fires in a landscape the local peoples had long since mastered, and the Americans plainly had not. They learned from residents who had lived there for generations exactly what lay farther west, which rivers to expect, which nations they would meet, which mountains stood in their path, which dangers to prepare for. The towns became, in every real sense, a place of exchange, goods, knowledge, company, and outright survival, freely offered by people who owed these strangers nothing at all, and who could easily have simply let the winter do its work instead. Picture it, the endless white stretching outside, wind screaming flat across the plains, and inside, warmth and food and the low murmur of a language the Americans were only just beginning to understand, given freely by a people with no obligation to give anything at all. And it was here, inside this winter town, in the very middle of this quiet dependence, that a single new member joined the expedition, someone who would go on to become the most recognizable figure connected to the entire journey. Someone the heroic version of this story would later flatten into a statue, a coin, a simplified legend, while quietly erasing almost everything true and difficult about who she actually was. A teenager, a captive, a new mother with a newborn son. You already know her name, Sacagawea. Chapter 9, who Sacagawea actually was. You almost certainly know her name. You have probably seen her face, carved into a golden dollar coin, cast in bronze on a pedestal somewhere, painted on a mural pointing serenely toward the western horizon like a living compass. The country built her, after the fact, into one of its most beloved symbols, the noble young guide who led two brave white explorers safely through the wilderness. Almost none of that is true in the way it is usually told, and the real version, painful as it is, matters far more than the legend. Start with what we actually know. She was Shoshone by birth, born sometime around 1788 in the mountain country of what is now Idaho, among a people who lived in the high valleys near the Continental Divide, moving with the seasons between the mountains and the plains to hunt buffalo. As a young girl, probably around the age of 12, she was captured during a raid by a rival nation, the Hidatsa, who ranged widely across the northern plains and periodically warred with mountain peoples over territory and horses. She was carried hundreds of miles from her home, from her family, from the only landscape she had ever known, into a completely different world among strangers who spoke a language she did not understand. At some point after her capture, she came into the possession of a French-Canadian fur trader named Toussaint Charbonneau, a man considerably older than her, living among the Hidatsa villages near what would become Fort Mandan. The exact arrangement is murky and uncomfortable by any modern standard. She is generally described as one of his two wives, though wife, in this context, meant something closer to property acquired than partner chosen. She had no real say in the matter. She was, in the plainest terms available, a captured child handed into the household of a much older man who had, in effect, purchased or won her. When Lewis and Clark arrived at Fort Mandan in the autumn of 1804 and began looking for an interpreter who could help them communicate with the Shoshone nations they expected to meet far to the west, nations who alone could provide the horses the expedition would desperately need to cross the mountains, Charbonneau was hired for his language skills. And because his household came as a package, Sacagawea came with him, still a teenager, already pregnant with their first child. Over that long, brutal winter at Fort Mandan, in temperatures cold enough to freeze mercury in a thermometer, she went into labor. It was a difficult, prolonged birth. Lewis himself, acting as the expedition's medical officer, recorded the event in his journal, noting that another member of the party suggested a folk remedy, a small dose of crushed rattlesnake rattle mixed with water, to speed the delivery along. Whether it actually helped or the labor simply ran its course, she gave birth to a son, whom she and Charbonneau named Jean-Baptiste, though the men of the expedition would soon nickname him Pompey, a name Clark, in particular, grew fond of, and later attached permanently to a sandstone formation in Montana still known today as Pompey's Pillar. So sit with the actual sequence of events here, stripped of the statue and the coin. A girl, taken from her family and her homeland as a child, handed into the household of a much older stranger who had effectively acquired her, giving birth, still a teenager herself, in a freezing earthen fort at the edge of the known world. And then, with an infant not yet 2 months old strapped to her back, setting out to walk into some of the most punishing wilderness on the continent, alongside 40 armed men she had never chosen to travel among, toward a destination she had no real say in choosing. That is who set out from Fort Mandan in April of 1805, as the ice finally broke on the river, and the expedition prepared to push west into entirely unmapped country. And here is the part of her story that survives the erasure, the part that is genuinely true even after you strip away every layer of legend. She became essential to the expedition's survival, not through some mystical gift for pathfinding, as the later legend insists, but in far more concrete, far more human ways. She recognized edible plants and roots that the Americans, unfamiliar with the region, would otherwise have walked straight past, wild artichokes dug from riverbank soil, certain tubers that could supplement the men's increasingly monotonous diet of meat. In late May of 1805, when a sudden squall very nearly capsized one of the boats, sending irreplaceable journals, scientific instruments, and medicine overboard into the churning current, it was Sacagawea, with her infant son still on her back, who calmly reached out and recovered many of the floating items before they were lost forever, an act both Lewis and Clark specifically praised in their journals afterward. And perhaps most significantly of all, her mere presence quietly transformed how every nation the expedition encountered interpreted their arrival. As Clark himself would later observe almost in passing, a war party does not travel accompanied by a young woman carrying an infant. Wherever the Corps went, the sight of Sacagawea and her baby signaled something no formal speech or ceremonial medal ever could. These strangers had not come to make war. A woman and a child, walking openly among a party of armed men, was itself a kind of universal peace flag, disarming suspicion, opening doors, easing tensions the Americans themselves had no idea how to ease on their own. The Corps owed her an enormous debt, and it was never remotely repaid. When the journey finally ended, the men who had walked it were rewarded with land grants, back pay, and public recognition. She received none of it, not officially, not in any form comparable to what her male companions were given. And her own voice, her own private thoughts about any part of this extraordinary and traumatic journey are almost entirely absent from the historical record. We have many thousands of words written by Lewis and by Clark. From Sacagawea herself, across the entire expedition, we have almost nothing directly, a handful of brief mentions, glimpsed only through the eyes of the men recording their own observations of her. What did she actually think, this young captured woman, as she carried her infant son back toward the very mountains from which she had been stolen as a child years earlier? We will return to that question, because the journey was about to hand her one of the strangest coincidences in the entire history of American exploration. But first, the country ahead had to be survived, and it very nearly refused to let them pass. Chapter 10. Into Grizzly Country. The expedition left Fort Mandan on the 7th of April, 1805, in a smaller, lighter fleet than before. The large keelboat, no longer useful in the shallower waters ahead, was sent back downriver to St. Louis, loaded with crates of specimens, reports, and letters for Jefferson, seeds, mineral samples, animal skins, even a few live prairie dogs and a magpie, meant to travel all the way back to the president's own house as living proof of what lay in this newly purchased territory. In their place, the Corps now relied on smaller, more maneuverable canoes, better suited to the increasingly unpredictable water ahead. Lewis, in a rare moment of open optimism recorded in his journal, wrote that he felt himself to be in the finest possible spirits, embarking now on a truly unexplored stretch of the continent that no educated man had ever set eyes upon before. It is one of the few passages in the entire expedition where his usual guardedness gives way, however briefly, to genuine joy. That joy did not last uninterrupted for long. As the party pushed deeper into what is now Montana, they entered country thick with a creature they had heard rumors of from the Mandan and Hidatsa all winter, but had not yet fully understood: the grizzly bear. The native nations along the river had warned the Americans repeatedly that these bears were nothing like the black bears familiar to the men from the eastern woodlands, that a grizzly could absorb an enormous number of musket balls and keep coming, that hunting one alone was considered a mark of real courage among warriors precisely because of how dangerous it was. The Americans, confident in their own firearms and their own experience hunting black bears back east, did not initially take the warnings especially seriously. They learned quickly. One bear, shot multiple times by several hunters simultaneously, continued charging for what felt like an impossibly long stretch of time before finally collapsing. Another chased two men directly into the river, forcing them to dive beneath the surface to escape, only to have the animal wade in partway after them before finally giving up the pursuit. On one particularly harrowing occasion, 6 of the expedition's best hunters together fired 10 rounds into a single grizzly at close range, and the animal still managed to charge 2 of them, forcing the men to leap off a steep riverbank into the water below to survive. Lewis himself, out walking alone one afternoon in pursuit of buffalo, found himself chased directly toward a river by a grizzly moving at what he described as full speed, and only escaped by wading directly into the water himself, at which point, for reasons no one fully understood, the bear inexplicably broke off the chase. By early summer, Lewis had come to a grim, almost resentful respect for the animal, writing that he would frankly rather engage 2 hostile native warriors in combat than face a single wounded grizzly bear in the open. It is a small detail, but it tells you something the mural version of this story rarely bothers to include. Even the wildlife of the American West was not a passive backdrop to human heroism. It was a genuine, active danger, capable of ending the entire expedition on any given afternoon, entirely independent of any human conflict at all. Chapter 11. The Fork in the River. By early June of 1805, the expedition arrived at a genuinely dangerous decision point. The Missouri split into 2 substantial rivers, and nothing in any map available to the party indicated which branch was the true Missouri. The one that would, according to the dream, lead them toward the mountains and eventually toward the source, and which was simply a large tributary that would lead them badly astray, wasting weeks or months of a rapidly narrowing traveling season. This was not a trivial mistake to risk. Choosing incorrectly could mean discovering the error only after days of hard upstream travel, at which point turning back would cost the expedition critical time before the mountain passes closed with the first heavy snows of autumn. It could, quite plausibly, mean the difference between reaching the Pacific and dying in the mountains partway there. Lewis and Clark studied the two forks carefully. The northern branch was muddy, thick with sediment, and resembled the familiar character of the Missouri they had followed for over a year. The southern branch ran clear and fast over a rocky bed, behaving more like a mountain stream fed directly by melting snow. Nearly every experienced member of the party, men who had spent years on western rivers, believed the muddy northern fork was the true Missouri, since it matched the river's established character so closely. Lewis and Clark disagreed with their own men. They reasoned, correctly as it turned out, that a river originating high in snowy mountains would naturally run clear, while a river draining lower plains country would naturally carry more sediment. It was a reasoned bet, but still only a bet, made against the confident judgment of experienced boatmen. To resolve it, they split the party temporarily, sending small scouting groups up each fork on foot to look for evidence. Most critically, for the sound and sight of a waterfall the Hidatsa had specifically described to them back at Fort Mandan as lying along the true Missouri, not far ahead. Lewis, scouting up the southern fork himself, walked roughly 15 miles before finally hearing, and then seeing, a spectacular waterfall exactly matching the Hidatsa description proof, at last, that this clearer, faster river was indeed the true Missouri. He and his small party had guessed correctly, against the collective judgment of nearly the entire expedition, and it likely saved the mission weeks of ruinous backtracking. But the discovery of the falls brought its own brutal price, because it turned out there was not simply one waterfall to Portage around. There were 5, spread across roughly 18 miles of the river, an obstacle course of cascading water that the maps and the Hidatsa's original description had drastically understated. Chapter 12. The Great Falls Portage. What followed has a strong claim to being the single most physically punishing stretch of the entire 2.5-year expedition, arguably more brutal, in raw daily suffering, than even the mountain crossing that lay further ahead. The 18 miles around the falls of the Missouri could not simply be walked. Every canoe, every barrel of remaining supplies, every scientific instrument, every pound of ammunition had to be manually hauled overland, around the falls, back down to navigable water on the far side. The men constructed crude wheeled carts from cottonwood trees to help drag the heaviest loads, but the ground itself fought them at every step. A landscape covered in a plant the men came to despise more than almost anything else they encountered on the entire journey: prickly pear cactus. The cactus grew in dense mats across the Portage route, its spines capable of punching straight through the soles of the men's worn-out moccasins. Clark's own journal entries from this stretch read almost like a medical log of accumulating injury: men limping badly, feet swollen and inflamed, spines that had to be dug out of torn flesh nightly by firelight, only for the entire process to repeat again the following day. The temperature swung viciously between blistering midday heat, intense enough to cause heat exhaustion, and violent hailstorms that struck with almost no warning, hailstones large enough to draw blood and briefly knock men unconscious where they stood in the open plain. On top of the terrain and the weather, the Portage route ran directly through some of the densest grizzly bear territory the expedition had yet encountered, forcing exhausted, half-starved men hauling heavy carts to remain constantly alert for an attack even as their bodies screamed for rest. One night, a bear wandered directly into the expedition's camp. On another occasion, a sudden flash flood very nearly swept Clark, Sacagawea, her infant son, and Charbonneau to their deaths in a narrow ravine, the water rising with terrifying speed around them before they managed to scramble to higher ground, losing supplies and nearly losing their lives in the process. The portage, which the men had originally estimated might take a matter of days, ultimately consumed nearly a full month. When it was finally complete, the expedition was already significantly behind the pace it needed to maintain in order to cross the mountains ahead before the first serious snows of autumn arrived. Every day lost at the falls was a day that would later be measured, quite literally, in starvation further up in the Bitterroot Mountains. By the time the men finally relaunched their canoes above the falls, sometime in mid-July of 1805, they were already thinner, more exhausted, and more anxious than at any previous point in the journey. And the true mountains, the ones that would eventually shatter the entire dream behind the expedition, had not yet even come into view. Chapter 13: Three Forks and a Rising Fear. Above the falls, the character of the country shifted again. The river split and split again, narrowing steadily into smaller, faster, colder branches as the party climbed toward what is now southwestern Montana. In late July, they reached a point where three separate rivers converged to form the Missouri itself, a location Lewis and Clark named, with characteristic directness, Three Forks. They named the three converging rivers after members of the Jefferson administration: the Jefferson, the Madison, and the Gallatin. It was here that the expedition's greatest remaining fear began to sharpen into something close to genuine dread. The dream, remember, held that the source of the Missouri would sit close to the source of the Columbia, separated by a single manageable ridge. But nowhere in this country had they yet found any sign of the mountain nation whose help they now needed more urgently than at any previous point in the journey. The Shoshone, Sacagawea's own people, the only nation for a considerable distance who possessed horses. Without horses, the expedition could not possibly carry its remaining supplies and equipment over whatever mountainous terrain lay ahead, and the season was turning against them with visible speed. Nights were growing noticeably colder. The days were shortening. Lewis, increasingly anxious in his private journal entries, understood with total clarity what failure to find the Shoshone would mean. The expedition would be stranded too far from any settlement to retreat safely, too weakly provisioned to attempt a mountain crossing on foot while hauling everything by hand, facing a winter in high, unfamiliar country with no reliable source of food. They pushed on, following the Jefferson River as it narrowed further into what is now the Beaverhead Valley, scanning the surrounding hills constantly for any sign of human presence, old campfires, worn trails, anything at all. The Shoshone, understandably wary of enemy raiding parties like the one that had captured Sacagawea years earlier, kept characteristically to high, defensible ground, and remained frustratingly difficult to locate by anyone they did not already wish to be found by. The fear must have been suffocating. To have endured so much, the standoff with the Lakota, the endless dragging of boats against the current, the Grizzly attacks, the brutal month spent hauling everything around the falls, only to fail now, quietly, in the high cold silence, for want of horses and a handful of friendly faces that simply refused to appear. So Lewis did what Lewis characteristically did under pressure. He went ahead of the main party on foot, taking only a small handful of men, racing the shortening days, determined to find the Shoshone himself before it was too late, and in doing so, to become the first man from the expedition to look, at long last, upon the thing an entire nation had gambled its future on finding. Chapter 14: The Reunion. Before we follow Lewis up to that final ridge, the story demands a pause, because what happened next involves a coincidence so genuinely improbable that if it appeared in a novel, most readers would set the book down, unwilling to accept it. While Lewis pushed ahead on foot, the rest of the party, including Sacagawea, still carrying her infant son, worked its way up the narrowing river behind him. Lewis's small scouting group made contact first. After days of searching increasingly desolate, empty-looking high country, his party finally encountered a small group of mounted Shoshone, who were initially deeply wary, clearly poised to flee at the first sign of danger, uncertain whether these strange, unfamiliar men represented a threat. Lewis, through careful, deliberate gestures of peace, laying down his weapon, approaching slowly, offering gifts, managed to convince the group that the Americans meant no harm. He was eventually brought before their leader, a man named Camouflage. What followed was a delicate, high-stakes negotiation. The entire expedition's survival now depended on whether this particular band of Shoshone would agree to trade horses and provide guidance through the mountains ahead. And Camouflage, understandably, had no obvious reason to trust a small party of strange, foreign men who had appeared without warning in his territory. Then the rest of the corps caught up to Lewis's advance party, and Sacagawea was brought forward, as she had been so many times before, to help translate between the Americans and the Shoshone people whose language she had not spoken since childhood. And as the formal council began, as she looked across at the man holding the fate of the entire expedition in his hands, she recognized him. Camouflage, the very chief whose cooperation the expedition desperately needed, was her own brother. Sit with the scale of that for a moment. A girl, stolen from her family as a small child, carried hundreds of miles away into captivity, passed years later into the household of a much older stranger, drawn by an unlikely chain of events into a foreign expedition crossing an entire continent. And at the single most critical juncture of the entire journey, deep in unfamiliar mountains, the one person capable of securing the horses the expedition absolutely needed to survive turns out to be her own lost brother. Reunited across all that distance and all those years by what can only honestly be described as extraordinary chance. The reunion transformed the tone of the negotiation almost instantly. The restored bonds of family plainly warmed what had begun as a cautious, uncertain diplomatic exchange between strangers. The Shoshone agreed to help. The expedition secured the horses it needed, along with a guide familiar with at least part of the brutal country still ahead. It is tempting, lying here in the dark, to let this feel like fate reaching down at the exact right moment to rescue the mission. And there is room to let it feel that way tonight, if you want it to. But hold, too, the other side of this reunion, the side the legend conveniently skips past. This was a young woman returned, for a handful of brief days, to the people and the homeland she had been violently torn away from as a child, only to be required to move on again almost immediately, deeper into the mountains, away from her brother and her homeland once more, carrying her infant son into a foreign mission she had never chosen to join in the first place. We do not know what that cost her. We will never know. Her own voice, once again, is silent in the historical record. The horses were secured. A path forward, such as it was, now lay open. And Lewis, ahead of the formal council, had already climbed higher into the surrounding hills, determined to look west with his own eyes at last, and finally see the thing the entire expedition, the entire nation really, had been sent across a continent to find. Chapter 15, Lemhi Pass. The date was August 12, 1805. The place was a high, windswept saddle on what is today the border between Montana and Idaho, a location now known as Lemhi Pass, sitting almost exactly on the spine of the North American continent. By this point, the Missouri River, the same river that had fought Lewis and Clark for well over a year, across more than 1,000 miles of dragging, poling, and rowing, had dwindled down to a small, ice-cold trickle running out of the surrounding hills, barely wide enough to call a stream. One of the men in Lewis's small advance party, in a moment of genuine, almost giddy wonder recorded afterward, stepped directly across it with one foot planted on either bank, laughing at the sheer improbability of straddling, in a single stride, the same mighty river that had nearly killed them all 100 times over on the journey up from St. Louis. Lewis knelt and drank from it. He had reached the literal source, what he would later describe in his journal as one of the great objects his mind had been fixed upon for years. After every mile of suffering behind him, he had arrived at last, at the exact place the entire mission had been bending toward from the very beginning. And now there was only the ridge itself standing above him, the actual dividing line of the continent. On the far side, according to the dream that had launched this entire expedition, the land was supposed to fall away gently toward the Pacific, where somewhere below the headwaters of the Columbia River would be waiting. The Western River, the final leg of the long-imagined water road to the ocean. A short walk downhill. A canoe returned to the water. A gentle current carrying them the rest of the way to the sea. 3 centuries of European hope. A nation's treasury spent almost entirely on faith. 2.5 years of dragging, starving, freezing, and negotiating for survival. All of it had narrowed now to a single short climb and a single glance to the west. Lewis climbed the last stretch of rise. He reached the crest. He looked west. There was no river waiting below. There was no gentle slope rolling down toward the sea. There was no shining water road, no easy portage, no dream made real. There were mountains, range after range after range of them, marching away toward the horizon in every direction his eye could follow. Peak behind peak behind peak, their summits still carrying patches of snow in the middle of August, stretching out past the visible edge of the sky. In his own journal, in his own handwriting, Lewis recorded what he actually saw. Immense ranges of high, rugged mountains still to the west, their summits partially covered in snow. Not one ridge to cross, not one manageable hill. An entire ocean of stone, vast, cold, and utterly indifferent, standing directly between him and the Pacific Ocean. The Northwest Passage did not exist. It had never existed. Not by sea, around the frozen top of the world, where sailors had died chasing it for 300 years. And not here either, not by river, through the gentle heart of the continent, where Jefferson had spent years quietly convincing himself it must be waiting. There was no water road across America. There never had been. The oldest hope of the New World, the hope that had launched entire fleets, emptied national treasuries, and now sent 2 young men across a continent to their possible deaths, died in a single, almost completely silent moment, on a remote mountain pass, witnessed by only a handful of exhausted men. And the cruelest part of it is precisely how quiet the moment was. There was no enemy to fight in that instant, no storm to rage against, no dramatic catastrophe to blame. Just one tired man standing alone on a ridge, staring at a truth he could not undo, understanding in a single breath that the thing his country had sent him across an entire continent to locate had been a ghost from the very beginning. He did not have the luxury of falling apart. There was no time for that. Winter was already closing in behind schedule after the disastrous month lost at the Great Falls Portage. The men remaining behind him were far from any real safety, and the only viable direction left was forward, on horses borrowed from the Shoshone, over the very mountains that had just quietly ended the dream, through some of the most punishing terrain on the entire continent. The dream was dead. The expedition was not. He would have to turn around, walk back down to the men waiting below, and lead them directly into the thing that had just defeated him. Chapter 16. The Bitterroots. The mountain range waiting ahead was called the Bitterroots, and of everything the Corps of Discovery endured across 2.5 years, this stretch came closer than any other to simply killing them all. The dream, remember, had promised a short, gentle carry between 2 rivers. The reality was a maze of steep, knife-edged ridges and deep, frigid valleys choked with fallen timber, stretching on far longer and far more brutally than anyone in the party had imagined possible. They traveled now largely on horseback, following a rugged trail across the high country with the guidance of an elderly Shoshone man they called Old Toby, hired specifically for his knowledge of a route through this exact stretch of mountains. Almost immediately, conditions turned genuinely desperate. The first serious enemy was cold. The party was crossing at significant elevation just as autumn tipped over into winter, and snow began falling early and heavily, deepening steadily on the trail, obscuring the route entirely in places, soaking the men through during the day and freezing them solid overnight. The horses struggled constantly on the steep, icy ground. Several fell and irreplaceable gear tumbled with them down the slopes, lost for good. The second enemy, the one that came closest to finishing what the cold had started, was outright starvation. The great herds of game that had sustained the men across the plains were entirely absent up here, a distant memory in this high, broken, nearly lifeless country. Game grew scarce to the point of near total absence, even as the men burned enormous amounts of energy simply staying upright and moving over the punishing terrain. Their food supplies dwindled, then dwindled further, and then simply ran out. The men grew weak. Several grew genuinely sick, likely from a combination of exhaustion, cold, and a drastic, sudden shift in diet. Cold and starvation fed on each other, steadily hollowing the party out as they pushed higher and deeper into the range. Eventually, they were reduced to the last, grimmest resort available to starving travelers in the wilderness. They began killing and eating their own horses, one by one, the very animals they needed to carry their remaining supplies over the mountains, slaughtered simply to keep the men alive a little longer. Clark's journal from this stretch records the men eating portable soup, a dried, concentrated bouillon Lewis had specifically purchased before departure as an emergency ration, and, in the very worst moments, resorting to eating tallow candles simply for the calories they contained. They staggered forward through deepening snow, freezing and famished, growing visibly weaker by the day, with no reliable way of knowing how much further this stone wilderness actually extended, or whether it would end at all before it finished them. This is the true cost the mural never shows. Not noble discovery beneath a painted sunset, starving men eating their own pack animals in the snow, lost in a mountain range that the dream had never accounted for, quietly paying in flesh and endurance for a hope that had already died behind them on a ridge a few weeks earlier. Chapter 17. The Mercy of the Nez Perce. When the party finally staggered down out of the worst of the high country in late September of 1805, barely half alive, and at the absolute limit of their physical endurance, they were rescued once again, not through any strength or cleverness of their own, but through the deliberate choice of another native nation. They stumbled into the territory of the Nez Perce, who found these ruined, half-starved strangers at the edge of their land, and chose, deliberately, to help them rather than exploit their obvious weakness. It would have cost the Nez Perce almost nothing to simply let the expedition perish, or to finish the job the mountains had nearly completed themselves. A small, defenseless party of foreigners, barely armed, barely able to stand. Historical accounts suggest that at least some among the Nez Perce leadership genuinely debated doing exactly that. Instead, they fed the men back toward health, sharing stores of dried salmon and camas root bread that the exhausted Americans, unaccustomed to the sudden richness after weeks of starvation, initially struggled to digest properly, leading to a fresh wave of illness across the party even as they finally began to recover their strength. The Nez Perce also agreed to look after the expedition's remaining horses over the coming winter, an arrangement that would prove critical to the return journey the following year, and helped guide the party toward the Clearwater River, where the Americans could finally build canoes and travel downstream, with the current at long last, rather than against it. Permission again, mercy again, freely given by the people whose land this actually was. The expedition had now survived in sequence on the tolerance of the Lakota, the generosity of the Mandan and Hidatsa, the loyalty of a reunited Shoshone chief, and now the deliberate compassion of the Nez Perce. 4 separate times, at 4 separate moments of maximum vulnerability, the entire mission had depended entirely on the choice of a nation that owed the Americans nothing, and that could very reasonably have chosen otherwise. The worst of the overland suffering was finally behind them. Ahead, at long last, lay rivers running the correct direction downhill toward the Pacific. Chapter 18: Ocean in View. After building new dugout canoes along the Clearwater River with Perce's assistance, the party moved swiftly downstream, first onto the Snake River and then onto the Columbia itself. The very river the original dream had promised would carry them gently and directly to the sea. For the first time in well over a year, the current was finally working in their favor rather than against them, and the pace of the journey noticeably quickened. The Columbia, however, brought its own serious dangers, particularly a series of violent rapids and waterfalls that had to be navigated with extreme care, and additional negotiations with the many distinct nations living along its banks, each with its own customs, trading practices, and expectations regarding these newly arrived strangers. Then, in early November 1805, as the river widened dramatically near the coast, Clark believed he finally saw it. He wrote the moment down in his journal in a burst of genuine, unfiltered joy in his characteristically rough spelling. Ocean in view, oh, the joy. After everything, the standoff with the Lakota, the month lost hauling boats around the Great Falls, the ridge where the dream had quietly died, the horses eaten in the snow, here at last was the Pacific, the far edge of the continent. The end of the road. Except it was not quite the ocean. What Clark had actually seen through the coastal mist was the wide, storm-tossed estuary where the Columbia River opened out toward the sea, still several miles short of the true open ocean itself. The genuine coastline lay a little farther on, and the final stretch to reach it would turn out to be one of the single most miserable passages of the entire expedition. The weather along that stretch of Pacific coast was, by any measure, savage. Cold, near-constant rain pinned the party down for days at a stretch, unable to move safely in canoes through violent coastal swells. Their remaining gear rotted steadily in the relentless damp. Food spoiled faster than it could be consumed or replaced. The men huddled in wretched, sodden camps along the shoreline, sick and thoroughly exhausted, so close now to their actual goal, and yet effectively trapped, battered by a coastline that had no interest whatsoever in the fact that they had just crossed an entire continent to reach it. When the party finally did reach the true, open Pacific coastline and could travel no farther west, there was, understandably, a genuine moment of triumph. They had done it. They had walked, dragged, starved, and paddled their way across the complete unknown breadth of a continent, from the settled edge of the United States to the Western Sea, and remarkably, most of them were still alive to mark the occasion. It was a genuinely staggering feat of human endurance, and it absolutely earned its moment of celebration. But there was no triumphant welcome waiting, no grand reward, no passage discovered, no golden proof that the entire gamble had paid off. There was only the literal end of the land, more gray water and unrelenting rain, and an entire long, hard winter still to survive before the party could even begin the equally demanding journey home. Chapter 19: Fort Clatsop. The Corps built a small, cramped log fort near the Pacific coast to see out the winter of 1805 to 1806, naming it Fort Clatsop after a local native nation living nearby. It was, by every account left behind, a grim and thoroughly wet place to spend several months. Clark's journal records that during their entire stay at the fort, rain fell on all but a small handful of days. A level of relentless, grinding dampness that rotted clothing, spoiled meat almost as quickly as it could be smoked or dried, and kept morale noticeably low across the entire winter. Throughout that long, wet season, the men kept a persistent, hopeful watch on the horizon for one specific thing that never actually arrived: a European or American trading ship. Such vessels were known to occasionally visit that stretch of Pacific coastline to trade with local nations, and Lewis and Clark had genuinely hoped one might appear, a ship that could carry their journals, maps, and specimens safely back to the eastern United States by sea, confirming to the wider world, well ahead of the party's own return, that the expedition had successfully reached the Pacific at all. No ship ever came. So when spring finally arrived, there was only one option remaining: turn around and walk the entire distance back. Every mile of it, the Columbia Rapids, the Bitterroot Mountains, the long plains, the full length of the Missouri River, reversed, in order to carry home to Washington the actual answer to the question the nation had spent a fortune sending them out to settle. And that answer, when it finally arrived back east, would prove to be the hardest one of all to accept. Not the joyful answer of a passage triumphantly found. The heavy, disappointing, world-altering answer of a passage that, after 3 centuries of hope on 2 separate continents, had never actually existed at all. Chapter 20, Turning Back. In late March of 1806, the Corps of Discovery left the sodden walls of Fort Clatsop behind and began the long journey east, retracing a route that was at least now familiar to them, even if familiarity offered little real comfort. They paddled back up the Columbia, fighting the current this time rather than riding it, then made their way overland to collect the horses the Nez Perce had faithfully kept safe through the winter, exactly as promised. But the mountains were not finished with them yet. The Bitterroots, still buried under deep snow in early summer, remained impassable, forcing the party to wait in Nez Perce territory for several additional weeks longer than they had planned, watching anxiously as their timetable for the year slipped further and further behind. It was not until late June that snow conditions finally allowed a crossing, and even then the passage was difficult and disorienting, with the party briefly losing the trail entirely in whiteout conditions before their Nez Perce guides managed to relocate it. Once safely back on the eastern side of the Bitterroots, Lewis and Clark made a decision that would have been unthinkable earlier in the expedition, when survival had depended so completely on staying together as one unified group. They decided to split the party in 2, in order to explore additional territory and gather more complete geographic information before reuniting downstream. Clark's group would head south and east, exploring the Yellowstone River, mapping its course down to its junction with the Missouri. Lewis, meanwhile, would take a smaller party north to explore the Marias River, a tributary Jefferson had specifically hoped might extend the useful boundary of American territory further north than previously mapped. A detail that reveals, once again, just how much of this expedition remained about political claim staking, even in its final months. It was during this northern detour that the expedition experienced its only genuinely violent encounter of the entire journey with a native nation. And notably, it did not happen with any of the powerful river nations who had held every advantage over the Corps for the past 2 years. It happened here briefly, unexpectedly, with a small group of young Blackfeet men. Chapter 21, The Marias River Encounter. In late July of 1806, Lewis's small scouting party encountered a group of 8 young Blackfeet warriors along the Marias River. The 2 groups camped together that night, sharing a fire, apparently on cordial terms, exchanging gifts and conversation through whatever combination of sign language and limited shared vocabulary they could manage. Sometime before dawn, the situation collapsed. According to Lewis's own account, the Blackfeet attempted to seize the party's guns and horses while the Americans slept, an act that, from the Blackfeet's likely perspective, may have been an attempt to establish dominance or simply acquire valuable trade goods, rather than an attack intended to kill. Whatever the precise intention, in the chaotic struggle that followed, one of the Blackfeet men was stabbed and killed by one of Lewis's men, and Lewis himself, in the confusion, shot and killed a second man who he believed was attempting to make off with the party's horses. It was the only time in the entire 2.5-year expedition that anyone died as a direct result of violence between the Corps and a native nation. Lewis's party fled the scene immediately afterward, riding hard for nearly 24 hours with minimal rest, fearing a larger retaliatory party might be following close behind. None ever materialized, at least not during the expedition's remaining time in the region, but the encounter would have serious long-term consequences. In the decades that followed, relations between American traders and the Blackfeet Nation remained frequently hostile, a tension future historians would trace in part back to this single violent night on the Marias. It is worth sitting with the fact, tonight, that after everything, after the standoff with the Lakota that could have ended everyone, after 2 years of careful diplomacy, gift-giving, and constant negotiated permission, the one moment of actual lethal violence in the entire journey came not from calculated conflict, but from a confused, half-understood scuffle in the dark, between two small groups who had shared a friendly fire together only hours earlier. Chapter 22. A Reunion and an Accident. Lewis's party rode hard to rejoin the Missouri and reunite with the men Clark had left behind to bring the canoes down, before continuing on to meet Clark's own group further downstream, as planned. Shortly after this reunion, the expedition suffered its strangest injury of the entire journey, one that reads, even in the sober language of the official journals, almost like dark comedy. While hunting elk along the riverbank, Lewis was accidentally shot in the thigh by one of his own men, a member of the party named Perce, who had extremely poor eyesight and apparently mistook Lewis, dressed in brown leather, for an elk moving through thick brush. Cruzet, when questioned afterward, denied firing the shot at all, and Lewis, in his own journal, wryly noted that he chose not to press the issue further, concluding it had clearly been an honest accident rather than any deliberate act. The wound was painful and left Lewis unable to walk normally for the following several weeks, forced to travel lying on his stomach in a canoe while it healed. An undignified, uncomfortable end to a journey that had, by this point, tested nearly every possible form of physical suffering the two men could experience. Clark's separate exploration of the Yellowstone, meanwhile, had gone considerably more smoothly, adding valuable new geographic information to the expedition's growing body of maps. The two parties reunited on the Missouri in mid-August 1806, and from that point on, traveled the remaining distance back to St. Louis together, now moving rapidly downstream with the full force of the current finally behind them for good. Chapter 23. The Return. The Corps of Discovery arrived back in St. Louis on the 23rd of September, 1806, roughly 2 years and 4 months after they had first departed. By this point, the expedition had been gone so long, with so little reliable news reaching the East, that most of the country, including President Jefferson himself, had genuinely begun to fear the entire party might be lost for good, presumed dead somewhere in the vast, unmapped interior of the continent. Their actual arrival back in St. Louis, by contrast, was met with immediate and overwhelming celebration. Crowds gathered along the riverbank. Church bells reportedly rang out across the town. Word spread rapidly east toward Washington that the expedition, against what many had quietly assumed, had not only survived, but had successfully reached the Pacific Ocean and returned largely intact. Of the roughly 33 permanent members who made up the core party at various points across the journey, only a single man had died during the entire 2.5-year expedition. Sergeant Charles Floyd, who succumbed early on, in August of 1804, to what modern physicians strongly suspect was a ruptured appendix, a condition that would have been fatal even with the best medical care available anywhere in the world at that time. Given the sheer scope of danger the expedition had faced, hostile encounters, grizzly attacks, disease, near drownings, starvation, brutal winters, and violent river currents, the survival of nearly the entire party stands as a genuinely remarkable achievement of leadership, discipline, and as this story has returned to again and again, considerable good fortune extended to them by the nations whose land they crossed. When Lewis and Clark finally arrived back in Washington to report formally to Jefferson, they carried with them the answer to the question that had launched the entire mission. And that answer, delivered quietly and without much fanfare in the official reports, was essentially this: there was no direct water passage across the continent. The Missouri and the Columbia did not connect by any short, manageable portage. Between their headwaters lay not one gentle ridge, but an entire immense system of mountain ranges, some of the most difficult terrain in North America, utterly impassable by any boat. The dream that had justified the Louisiana Purchase, that had launched the entire expedition, that Jefferson had turned over in his mind for years by candlelight, had been definitively proven false. Chapter 24. Rewriting Failure as Triumph. Here is one of the most quietly revealing details in this entire story, and it is worth sitting with for a moment before we move to what came after. The expedition had been sent to answer one specific practical question: is there a direct water route across the continent suitable for commerce? The honest answer it brought home was no. By the standard of Jefferson's own original secret instructions, the mission had failed at its central objective. But a young nation that had just spent an enormous fortune on a purchase, justified largely by that very dream, could not easily afford to publicly frame the outcome as a failure. So, gradually, almost without anyone consciously deciding to do it, the meaning of the entire expedition was quietly rewritten. The point was no longer framed as the passage that had turned out not to exist. The point became, instead, the crossing itself. The sheer scale of the achievement, the courage and endurance required, the vast wealth of new scientific and geographic knowledge brought home, the opening of the American West to future settlement and trade. Failure, through a slow, largely unspoken process of national storytelling, became triumph. The ghost the men had actually found on that mountain ridge was politely, gradually forgotten, and the mural began to take its familiar shape. Two brave explorers standing together, pointing confidently west into a noble, waiting wilderness. What the expedition did bring home in the end turned out to matter far more, in practical terms, than the river ever could have. Clark's carefully drawn maps offered, for the first time, a reasonably accurate picture of the vast western interior, its rivers, its mountain ranges, the genuine and formidable scale of the terrain that had killed the original dream. The party brought back detailed descriptions of hundreds of plant and animal species previously unknown to science in the East. And they brought back exactly the kind of detailed accounting of native nations that Jefferson's secret instructions had specifically requested: locations, populations, military strength, trading relationships, and political alliances. A careful, comprehensive inventory of the peoples and the resources of an entire newly acquired territory. And this is where the story turns from simple disappointment into something considerably darker, and where the true nature of the expedition finally comes fully into view. All of that knowledge, the maps, the trail routes, the detailed catalog of nations and their strengths and weaknesses, became, in the years and decades that followed, the essential tool for everything that came next. Traders followed the routes the expedition had mapped, then soldiers, then settlers in ever-increasing numbers, then eventually railroads, cutting directly through territory the Corps had been the first Americans to formally document. The expedition had not simply described the American West. It had made the West legible, comprehensible, mappable, navigable to a nation that fully intended to eventually claim it. And a detailed, accurate map, however scientifically valuable, is very often the first practical tool of taking. Hold that thought beside everything this story has already told you tonight. The nations who had saved the Corps of Discovery, who fed them, who supplied them with horses, who chose mercy again and again when they could easily have chosen otherwise, were, in nearly every case, the very same nations whose worlds this newly gathered knowledge would eventually help to dismantle. The Mandan and Hidatsa, who had warmed and fed the party through that first brutal winter. The Shoshone, whose horses and whose chief's own family connection had rescued the expedition at its most desperate moment. The Nez Perce, who had found the party starving and broken in the mountains and chose, deliberately, to save them rather than let them perish. Within a few short generations, nearly all of these nations would face similar fates: land seized through treaty or outright force, populations sharply reduced by imported disease and subsequent conflict, traditional ways of life, fundamentally disrupted by the very forces of expansion this expedition had helped set into motion. The core of discovery survived, quite literally, on the kindness of the people its own findings would eventually help to displace. That, tonight, is the actual thing Lewis and Clark found out in the American West. Not a passage, a truth, the truth that the land had never been empty, that it was full of established nations with their own histories and claims, and that the young country behind the expedition fully intended to have it regardless. Chapter 25. What became of them? The men at the center of this story scattered afterward into very different lives, and their individual fates say almost as much about the true cost of the expedition as anything that happened along the trail itself. William Clark, the steady, practical half of the partnership, went on to live a long and, by most conventional measures, successful life. He was eventually appointed to a series of increasingly senior government positions, overseeing relations with Native American nations across the Western territories. And here, history delivers one of its more uncomfortable ironies. The very man who had drawn the first genuinely accurate maps of these Western nations, who had depended so completely on their mercy and hospitality to survive his own journey, spent much of the remainder of his career administering the treaty processes and forced removals that would, over subsequent decades, strip many of those same nations of the land they had once so generously shared with him. It is unlikely Clark himself ever fully reckoned, in his own private thinking, with the full shape of that irony, but it sits there plainly enough in the historical record for us to see now. Meriwether Lewis fared considerably worse. The brilliant, restless, occasionally troubled man Jefferson had trusted with the entire mission did not find any real peace after his return. Jefferson appointed him governor of the Louisiana Territory, but Lewis struggled significantly with the demands of civilian administration, a role that suited his temperament far less naturally than frontier leadership had. He fell into serious financial difficulty, faced mounting political frustrations, and, according to most accounts from those who knew him during this period, sank into worsening depression. In October of 1809, while traveling along the Natchez Trace toward Washington, Lewis died from gunshot wounds under circumstances that remain genuinely disputed among historians to this day. Most contemporaries and early biographers concluded it was suicide, consistent with the darker moods those closest to him had long observed, though a minority of historians have since argued for the possibility of murder. He was only 35 years old. Whatever the precise truth of his final hours, the wilderness that had given him a kind of genuine greatness ultimately proved far kinder to him than the years that followed his return to ordinary life. York, the enslaved man who had carried, hunted, paddled, and scouted every single mile alongside the rest of the party, and who had briefly experienced something closer to genuine equality and respect during the journey than he had ever known in his life, was simply returned to slavery upon the expedition's conclusion. Clark, according to later accounts, initially refused York's requests for his freedom, despite York's years of essential service to the mission. Clark eventually granted York his freedom at some point years later, and by some accounts helped set him up with a wagon business. Though the historical record here is thin and somewhat contradictory, and precisely what became of York in his final years remains genuinely uncertain to historians even today. Sacagawea's own later life is similarly difficult to pin down with full certainty, in large part because so little of her own voice survives in any record. Most historians believe she died in 1812, only a handful of years after the expedition's end, likely from illness, at a fur trading post in what is now South Dakota. Clark, notably, later took on formal guardianship of both of her children, raising and educating them at his own expense, a gesture that suggests a genuine, lasting bond had formed between them over the course of the journey, even if her own thoughts about the entire experience remain almost entirely lost to us. Chapter 26. The Painting on the Wall. The mural the country eventually settled on hanging is, in its own way, a genuinely beautiful one. Two courageous men, a bold, patriotic adventure, the confident dawn of a growing continental nation. But you have walked the real road tonight, and you understand now everything the mural conveniently leaves out. The secret political instructions folded quietly inside a scientific mission, the dream that turned out to be nothing more than a ghost, the powerful nations who genuinely held every real advantage at every single stage of the journey, the captured girl who became essential to the mission's survival and received almost nothing in return, the horses eaten out of sheer desperation in the snow, the repeated mercy of strangers who owed the Americans nothing at all, and the carefully gathered knowledge that would, in the decades that followed, become one of the primary tools of an enormous and largely one-sided taking. Both things, somehow, are simultaneously true. It was genuinely one of the great feats of human endurance ever attempted on this continent, and it was, at the very same time, one of the opening acts of a long, painful process of dispossession that would unfold across the following century. You do not have to choose between these two truths tonight, lying here in the dark. You are allowed to let them both be real at once. The courage and the cost, existing together. The way the truest version of almost any historical story always tends to hold more than one thing at the same time. Chapter 27. What the Land Remembers. Let the story settle now, slowly, the way frost settles over open ground once the wind finally dies down. We began this long night in a quiet room in Washington, with a brilliant, restless man staring at a map of a place he had never once visited, willing to wager 2 lives, and, in a sense, an entire fragile young nation, on a river that existed only inside his own hopeful imagination. And from there, we followed that river all the way to the truth, up the long, fighting current of the Missouri, past a standoff on a muddy riverbank that came within a single loosed arrow of ending everything before it had properly begun, through a winter that, by any reasonable measure, should have finished the whole expedition, were it not for the deliberate generosity of the Mandan and Hidatsa. Alongside a captured girl carrying her infant son, who found her own lost brother waiting at the exact moment the mission needed him most, and who then had to leave him again almost immediately, carrying her child onward into a journey she had never actually chosen for herself. Past grizzly bears that taught grown men real fear, and a month lost hauling boats and supplies around a series of waterfalls no map had properly warned them about. All the way up to a quiet ridge, and the single silent moment when the oldest dream of the New World finally died, in one man's unobstructed view of an endless ocean of stone. And you understand now, I think, what they actually found out there once you strip away the mural and look honestly at what remains underneath it. Not the passage, never the passage, because it was never there to find. They found, instead, a continent that was already full, already ancient, already alive with governments and borders and histories stretching back long before their own nation had a name. They found that their survival, at every single critical moment, depended entirely on the permission and the mercy of the people whose land they were crossing, permission that could have been withheld at almost any point, and very nearly was. And they carried home, without fully understanding what they were carrying, a body of knowledge that would be used in the decades that followed to slowly take nearly all of it away from the very people who had kept them alive long enough to bring it home. There are questions in this story that simply do not close, and you are welcome to let them drift along with you now, into whatever sleep is waiting on the other side of this sentence. Did Jefferson, somewhere in the quieter corners of his own mind, already suspect that the river was never really there, and send his 2 young friends west anyway, because some dreams are simply too expensive for a nation to let go of? What did Sacagawea actually feel in those few short days reunited with her own people, before she turned and carried her infant son away from them once again, deeper into a mission she had never had any real say in joining. What might the Mandan, the Shoshone, or the Nez Perce have chosen to do at that first tent standoff, at that first desperate winter, at that first starving descent out of the mountains, if they had somehow been able to see the whole of what the future actually held for them, carried west inside the packs of these strange, exhausted, oddly harmless-looking visitors? We will never know any of it for certain. The men who lived it are long gone. The captured girl who quietly helped hold the entire fragile mission together is gone. The old dream of a water road across a continent has been dead now for well over 200 years. The mural still hangs, more or less, in the version of this story most of us grew up with, but the real, more complicated story has always been sitting quietly underneath it, waiting, the way it always does. The land itself, though, is still there. The Missouri still runs its long, muddy fighting course down out of the high country, exactly as it always has. The mountains that quietly killed the dream still stand, range behind range behind range, snow still gathering on their highest peaks in the middle of summer, more or less exactly as one exhausted man saw them for the first time from a narrow ridge 2 centuries ago. The rivers still run, eventually, to the sea. The old trails those men once struggled along still lie, mostly forgotten, somewhere beneath the modern roads we drive today. And the nations who once held that world, who fed these tired strangers, who chose mercy again and again when they could easily have chosen otherwise, and who lost so very much in the years that followed, their descendants are still here, still carrying those same names forward, whatever the mural on the wall ever tried to suggest otherwise. So rest now. If this long walk through the dark tonight was worth taking, you're welcome to leave a gentle tap on the like button before you drift off, just a small, quiet signal that you'd welcome more nights like this one. And if you'd like to keep wandering with me through the hidden, more complicated undersides of the stories we all think we already know, consider subscribing, and I'll keep finding these old, buried, true things and bringing them to you here, in the dark. And if you feel like leaving a comment before sleep finally takes you, tell me once more tonight, where in the world you're listening from, and what the land outside your own window looks like right now. Plains, or mountains, or open desert, or the soft electric glow of a city that never quite sleeps. Because every kind of ground, wherever you happen to be lying tonight, carries something like the same deep memory underneath it. Every landscape on this earth was known, and walked, and loved by someone, long before any map we use today was ever drawn. Let the rivers keep running. Let the mountains keep standing exactly where they are. Let the old, long dream of an easy passage fade quietly into the dark, where it has always ultimately belonged. The continent is still out there, right now, in the dark beyond your window. It was always there. It was never truly empty, and it was never simply waiting to be discovered in order to be real. Sleep well tonight. The mountains will keep. The rivers will keep. And the old, true story underneath the mural will still be there quietly waiting for you, exactly as it is in the morning. Rest now. Let the high country do its slow, quiet work in your dreams.